Hello learners, today we will learn about class 10 history chapter 5 print culture and the modern world. We will divide this chapter in two parts. Today we will discuss about part 1 and main themes of part 1 would be earliest print in China. In this we will see how print developed in China, Japan and Korea. Then we will see how the print revolution started and how it gave birth to religious debates and who were the people who were fearful for print. Then we will talk about the reading mania in Europe and finally, we will see the role of print in French Revolution. But before moving ahead, let us talk about the learning outcomes of this session. At the end of this session, students will be able to describe the history of development of print in China and in Europe. They will be able to assess the impact of print revolution. Then they will be able to compare the process of development of print in China and Europe, and they will also be able to establish the link between print culture and its circulation of idea. Finally, they will be able to analyze the role of print in French Revolution. So, let us talk about the beginning of print. In fact, the earliest printer technology developed in the areas of China, Japan and Korea. Basically, it started with China around AD 594 and the print that those people used were called woodblock printing, in which they used to make the blocks made up of woods and then used it as print tool. Then let us talk about how did they use it and why did they use it. So, if we talk of particularly China, the print was used for making textbooks for civil services examination. It is a very amazing fact that in those days civil services examinations were held in China for bureaucratic selections. Then the merchants of China used to collect data and keep them in print form for their further information. Finally, women also started publishing their poetry and their plays in the form of print, because the wives of scholars, officials and high echelons of society got enough of time for publishing their works. Now, let us talk about how print travelled to Japan from China. It was basically carried by the Buddhist missionaries to Japan around 768 to 770 AD, and the oldest book that was printed was known as Diamond Sutra. And do you know what were the subjects of this book? Basically, books on women, musical instruments, calculations, tea ceremony of Japanese people, flower arrangements, proper etiquette, cooking and about famous places. So, these were the subjects that were talked about in print in Japan. Now, let us see how print reached Europe. As you know, Japan and China both are in Asia. There was a great explorer called Marco Polo. He lived in China for a very long time and then returned to Italy in 1295 AD. While in China, he learnt woodblock printing and introduced this to Italy first, and from there it travelled throughout Europe. That is how print got circulated in Europe. Now, let us do an activity based on what we learnt till now. Imagine that you are Marco Polo living in China. Write a letter from China to your mother describing the world of print which you have seen there. You must mention how woodblocks are made, how printing is done on paper and what are the benefits of printing. Now, let us talk about the need for quicker and cheaper reproduction of text. It means why printing text became so popular and why it became so important. First of all, handwritten manuscripts were very expensive and it was not affordable by one and all. It was a very time consuming process and very laborious kind of job. At the same time, manuscripts were very fragile. They were very tough to be carried from one place to another place. At the same time, they were very awkward to handle because of their sizes. So, it was very important that print developed and we moved from manuscripts to printing texts. Till now, whatever we talked about was about woodblock printing or hand printing. Now, let us talk about development of mechanical printing press in Europe. There was a person called Johann Gutenberg. He developed first known printing press in 1430s at Strasbourg, Germany. His father was a farming person and a businessman. He had an olive press. This olive press of his father provided the model for printing press to Johann Gutenberg. By 1448, he perfected this system of mechanical printing press and the first book that he printed here was Bible, but mind you, it took 3 years to him for printing 180 copies of Bible. But by the standard of that time, it was a great development in the field of print. Now, let us talk about the print revolution as to how it started in Europe. From 1450 to 1550, in the span of 100 years, printing press were set up in most part of the Europe and the book production boomed throughout Europe. 20 million printed books flooded the European market and in 16th century, it touched 200 million copies. So, it was a great development when lots of books were printed and it were introduced into the market, and it gave rise to debates and discussion. At the same time, it influenced the popular perceptions of the people of Europe. Let us do an activity based on our learning till now. Suppose, imagine that you are a bookseller advertising the availability of new cheap printed books. What you need to do? You need to design a poster for your shop window. Let us talk about the benefits of print revolution. When print revolution took place, many benefits occurred not only in Europe, but outside as well. For example, new reading public emerged in Europe because due to print, now books were available to one and all. At the same time, it reduced the cost of books as well. At the same time, it reduced the time and the labor because print was available in the market easily, and multiple copies of text and prints could be made at the same time. Finally, due to all these benefits, books flooded the market and print revolution occurred in Europe. Now, the time to understand how hearing public became reading public in Europe. First of all, reading was restricted to elites because to general publics books were not easily available. So, they were not studying much, but due to print, common people could read in isolation as well, and common people lived in oral culture now could read and write on their own. As a result, the knowledge which was earlier transferred through oral means got transferred through print now. At the same time, now it was easily possible for one and all to be in isolation, be single and read and enjoy books. That is how the hearing public changed into reading public. At the same time, they got intermingled with each other because anybody could read and anybody could hear. At the same time, a person who knew reading could read and other people could hear. That is how hearing public became reading public in Europe. Let us talk about how the hearing public and reading public became intermingled with each other. First of all, let us understand that literacy rate in Europe around that time was around 60 to 80%, and the printers published popular ballads and folk tales for all. Then books would be illustrated with pictures and they looked beautiful. They were then sung and recited at gatherings in villages and in taverns in towns. Oral culture thus entered print and printed material was orally transmitted. Let us talk about the religious debate and the fear of print now. First of all, let us talk about religious debates. Due to print, since everybody could read, now wide circulation of ideas was seen throughout Europe, and it gave birth to debate and discussion. At the same time, it persuaded people to think differently. But since religious debate and discussion was taking place now, there were people who were very fearful of print as well. So, who were those people who were fearful of print? There were two kind of people. Number one, the monarchs, and another one were people from church. People might become rebellious and irreligious. That was the thinking of church, and monarch thought if people become literate, if they start reading and studying, they might revolt against them. That is why monarchs and church was fearful of print. Then came a person called Martin Luther. He brought lots of change in Catholic religion. In 1517, religious reformer Martin Luther wrote 95 theses, and he pasted this on the church door in Wittenberg, Germany. His writings immediately were reproduced and vast number of copies were reprinted and they were read widely. In this 95 thesis, Martin Luther basically criticized the practices and rituals of Roman Catholic Church, and many people were impressed with his ideas. He also challenged the church to debate his ideas, and the result was it led to division within the church, and the Protestant Reformation movement took place, and Christianity got divided into two communities, the Catholic and the Protestants. Martin Luther's translation of New Testament sold 5,000 copies within weeks, and second edition of it appeared within 3 months. Martin Luther himself was so much impressed with the print that he used to say that printing is the ultimate gift of God and the greatest one. Mind you, this is a very important question for 3 or 5 marks. Now, on the basis of our learning till now, let us do an activity. Discuss with your friends why some people feared that development of print could lead to growth of dissenting ideas. Let us talk about reading mania in Europe. Friends, literacy rate in Europe was quite high from the standard of that time. It was rising from 60 to 80%. New forms of popular literature were printed. For example, almanacs or ritual calendars, along with ballads, folk tales, entertainment, science and philosophy. Peddlers roamed around villages carrying the little books for sale. So, it became available to even the people living in rural areas. If we talk of England, then penny chapbooks were carried by petty peddlers known as chapmen and sold for a penny. If we talk of France, Bibliothèque Bleue was a very low priced small books. It was printed on very poor quality of paper bound in cheap blue covers. So, in England, the penny chapbooks, and in France, Bibliothèque Bleue were very important form of text which was available to common people. If we talk of newspapers and journals, it combined current affairs with entertainment, information about wars, trade, development in different fields. That is how reading mania was raised in Europe. Now, let us talk about church. As I discussed, church was very fearful of print. So, it started maintaining an index of prohibited books. Question is why? Because print stimulated many distinctive individual interpretations of faith even among little educated working people. In 16th century, a miller in Italy called Menocchio reinterpreted the message of Bible. He formulated his own view of God and creation that emerged, and Roman Catholic Church was fearful of such ideas. Because Roman Church was especially troubled by popular reading and questioning of faith, it imposed controls over publishers and booksellers and began to maintain an index of prohibited books from 1558. Menocchio, he was hauled up, he was caught, and ultimately he was executed, because church did not want that type of person to live and criticize church. Now, let us do an activity. Answer the following questions with the help of given clue. First question is, name the first book printed by Gutenberg, and there is a clue for you. The second letter is I and the last letter is E. Question number 2, which movement led to a division within the church? The second letter is R, sixth letter is S and ninth letter is N. Question number 3, who introduced print to Europe? And the first letter is M and last letter is O. In between you have to fill it up. Now, let us talk about Louis Sebastian Mercier, who was a French writer and novelist in 18th century France. He was a great admirer of print because he believed that books could change the world, reason and intellect would rule in future. He believed that print would liberate society from despotism and tyranny. He believed that print was most powerful engine of progress and public opinion. If we talk about his writing and heroes and other characters of his novel, they got transformed through reading. He was so appreciable of print that he declared, "Tremble, therefore, trains of the world, trample before the virtual writer." When he said virtual writer, he meant print. Now, let us talk about the role of print in French Revolution. As we all know, print played a very important role in French Revolution. How? There were many thinkers and philosophers like Montesquieu, Voltaire and Rousseau who attacked the sacred authority of church and the despotic power of state. They promoted reason and rationality. Secondly, it created a culture of dialogue and debate. People could question existing ideas and beliefs. Then, new literature that were printed during this time, they mocked royalty and criticized their morality. The questions were raised about existing social orders as well. And finally, the cartoons and the caricatures that were printed, they suggested that monarchy remained absorbed in sensual pleasures and common people suffered hardships, and monarchs did not have anything to do with common public. That is how print played a very important role in French Revolution. On the basis of our learning till now, let us do an activity which is final activity. Imagine that you are a thinker and philosopher in France before the revolution. You support democracy. Pen down your ideas. Why do you think democracy is the best form of government? So, learners, we learnt about first part of print culture and the modern world till now. In second part, we will talk about how print came to India. Thank you.